Welcome to a special video edition of Time Capsule Cooking. Today I'm doing a video instead of just my normal blog because when a friend of mine heard what recipe I was going to be trying today, she wanted to see my immediate reaction rather than just hearing about it later. And that recipe in question is Campbell's famous tomato soup cake recipe, specifically spicy shortcake with applesauce. And that specific recipe is from Cooking with Condensed Soups. This is the second edition, but the first edition I can't imagine being too much different as far as the contents. So we're going to say that this recipe comes from 1952. For our ingredients today, we're going to need 1 3/4 cups of sifted cake flour, and those of you who know your flour will know that no, this is not cake flour. However, I don't have cake flour, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to be blending a mixture of all-purpose flour and cornstarch in hopes of making a suitable substitute for cake flour. You will also need 2 teaspoons of baking powder and 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda. You'll also need 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon of nutmeg, and 1/4 teaspoon of powdered cloves. We'll also need 3 tablespoons of butter or shortening. I'm choosing to use butter today. A 3/4 cup of sugar, and I can't have sugar, so instead I'm going to be using Splenda. We'll need 1 egg beaten. Of course, a can of condensed tomato soup. It would not be tomato soup cake without tomato soup after all. And 1 1/2 cups of applesauce, and that should be a little bit more than the 3 containers that I have set out in front of me. This is followed shortly afterwards, in my case, of realizing that the mixing bowl needs to be used for creaming the sugar and the butter instead of blending the dry ingredients, and thus having to move the dry ingredients from the mixing bowl into a smaller bowl. That done and the mixing bowl clean again, it's time to cream the butter. It'll get out of there. Butter, there we go, or shortening, and your sweetener of choice. That took a lot longer than I thought it was going to. Just so you know, if you want to know, if you're curious, if you ever end up working with Splenda instead of sugar, Splenda takes a lot longer to blend with butter or shortening or what have you than sugar does. But now that I have released a cloud of Splenda particles, microparticles into the air, it's time to add the egg, which hopefully should not take nearly so long. And the last step of the mixing process is combining the dry ingredients with the egg sweetener fat mixture along with our tomato soup, which we're going to do alternating these ingredients. Ah, lovely. I haven't looked at tomato soup in a while. So that interesting red-orangish color. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little bit of the tomato soup. And, that is tomato soup. Starting this, and we are going to stir these together instead of using a blender. And finally, we are left with this, which has an interesting kind of color to it. It's thankfully not nearly as tomatoey of a scent as when I started off stirring this whole thing up. It still has a definite whiff of tomato to it, but not nearly as strong, at least. Okay, so before this gets tossed in the oven, of course, we have to throw it into our baking pan. And the recipe calls for a 9-inch pan. If there is one thing to be said for this batter, it is definitely on the thick side of things. And I'm going to smooth this out. As I said, a 9-inch pan that is greased and floured. And of course, the flour is letting it not quite go to the edge. Last step is to pop this into the oven for 40 to 50 minutes. And initially, I was thinking that sounded like an awful lot of time for one 9-inch cake, but seeing how thick this sucker is, I can kind of understand. So I'm going to go for 40 minutes initially, cross my fingers that nothing comes up with this recipe and the oven temperature, and see you back in a bit. So after 40 minutes in the oven, I figured it would probably be the best idea to go ahead and take it out then. It was starting to look a little dark around the edges, really starting to pull away from the pan at that point. It is out of the oven. I have let it sit for a while, and the recipe says for it to be cold by the time that you put the applesauce in and try it. And I'm impatient, so I went ahead and I cut it into 8 pieces, actually 9. I cut it anyway, and I stuck a piece in the fridge because I wanted to go ahead and try it. But here's what it looks like in the pan. As you can see, kind of pulling away a little bit, but a pretty color. And here is what it looks like with the applesauce. And I have no idea how this is going to taste so far. It smells nice, but that doesn't always mean anything. I don't think it should be too dry, but especially with the applesauce, but we will see. It cuts interestingly. It is really thin. I was kind of surprised at how thin it was and the fact that it didn't raise all that much. But I can definitely taste the spice. Thankfully, I cannot taste the tomato soup. Now, whether that's just because the applesauce in the middle masks it or whether there's just none in the taste of it whatsoever, I'm not certain. But an easy way to test that. Just a plain piece. No. Nope, no tomato, thankfully. It is a little dry. Just by itself, it really does need the applesauce if you are going to bake it for that long. And I'm still surprised, as I said, how thin it ended up being. But not a bad recipe overall. I don't know if I'll end up doing it again, but I certainly don't feel like I wasted my time today in trying this one. That is it for today, guys. If you enjoyed this video, if you want me to do more in the future, let me know. And until the next recipe, see you guys.